gentlemen, welcome to our webinar today, Why Go Natural Gas, with Alicia Milner, sharing on the Canadian business case for NGVs. I'm your host, Dave Orton. I'm Senior Vice President of Global Business Development and Marketing here at IMW, and in the studio with us as well is Dave Van Laar, our Product Solutions Group Manager and Professional Engineer. And on the line with us remotely is Alicia Milner. Alicia leads Canada's National Trade Association for Natural Gas Vehicles, the Canadian Natural Gas Vehicle Alliance, and led the industry in working with Natural Resources Canada and a broad group of stakeholders to develop the natural gas use in the Canadian transportation sector deployment roadmap. This focused on environmental and economic benefits of increased use of natural gas for medium and heavy-duty fleets in Canada. Alicia also leads the marine LNG project jointly funded by Transport Canada and industry, which aims to identify and address the barriers for LNG use in Canada's marine transportation sector, obviously applicable to all of our global audience. Ms. Milner is also past chair of NGV Global, the International Association for Natural Gas Vehicles, and sits on Canada's National Advisory Council on Energy Efficiency, as a member of the Canadian Society of Association Executives. IMW is a manufacturer of industrial natural gas compressors focusing on non-lubricated compression technology. In addition, IMW also has a full system of industrial virtual pipeline equipment. Our parent company, Clean Energy Fuels, Los Angeles-based, leads the charge in the U.S. on America's natural gas highway and the development of the natural gas vehicle industry in the U.S. For those of you who are engineers on the line, and we are focused on definitely a technical audience with these webinars, the session you're in right now will count for one technical 1 hour of technical informal credit. And if you are in a boardroom with several engineers around, as Human Resources tends to make sure that you get your credits, please assign a scribe and jot down name, job title, company, and email, and send your list of engineers to webinars@imw.ca, and we'll ensure that you receive proof of attendance for each of your attendees for this session. Again, supporting us on this side, making this a valid technical credit, is our own professional engineer, Dave Van Laar. If you wish to join the discussion, please feel free. You'll note on the right-hand side of your screen there is a control panel there. We recommend using the messaging section there just like you would any SMS. So if you have questions, you can type them in there, send them off to us. They'll pop up on our screen here. And at times through the presentation, we may stop and answer that, and definitely at the end when there's an active Q&A. So without further ado, we'll ask Alicia to come off mute and start her presentation.
So Alicia, you now have control as the presenter. And let's just see if we can get your audio going here.
All right.
There we go.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Dave. And that's great to hear that we've also got Dave Van Laar, who's certainly a good expert to have available for today's webinar. I want to first of all welcome everyone joining, both from Canada and from the United States. This presentation will focus on Canadian market developments for natural gas vehicles. And I will warn my American colleagues, anyone who's joining from the U.S., that I will be using metric units, but I'll try to give you some assistance on conversion as we go there on an as-needed basis. I would like to say, though, before we start the presentation, in the Canadian market, there's certainly a lot of lessons learned from south of the border, from the U.S. market, that have been really important, and we're now starting to see the benefits of applying those lessons in Canada. And this includes things like focusing on return-to-base fleets, looking at regional trucking corridors, and really learning from the experiences in the U.S. over the past 5 to 7 years. So, yeah, we absolutely are benefiting by that in Canada, and I'm pleased to share with you first. I'm going to go through some highlights of what is happening in Canada as far as market development, and then start to get into more of the business case for individual fleets.
Just to clarify, Alicia, too, it's Dave. We have an international audience on this, so we definitely have folks from Latin America on board, as well as Europe. So, as usual, Canada is sort of the bridge there. So I'm sure both metric and imperial will be appreciated.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Dave. And I should just ask too, the Go With Meeting dashboard, is that still visible, or do I need to hide that in some way? I can see it on my end. You don't see it? Okay, perfect. All right, just to make sure. Okay, so what has been happening in Canada? Certainly over the last couple of years, we've had 4 major CNG transit fleet projects announced, and I'm going to get into more details, obviously, as I go through the presentation. 11 major CNG refuse fleet projects are now underway, and again, 4 years ago, we did not have a natural gas refuse truck in Canada. So this is huge, and these trucks are going in at 25 to 50 trucks per site at a time. There's also 12 highway tractor projects that have launched, everything from sort of 5 trucks up to 120 trucks, and I'm going to share more information. And those are both CNG and LNG projects. And then to support all this new activity, a lot of new refueling station investments, LNG and CNG, both to support the return-to-base opportunities and for the regional trucking corridors. So that's pretty exciting. Going on to what type of vehicles are we seeing coming into the market, here's the breakout in terms of transit bus, that's the small blue slice, the 50 of them, refuse trucks, the purple, and then highway tractors are the green. And what's really amazing now as we start to finally see the market turn the right way in Canada, we're seeing activity in different parts of the country. From the West Coast through to Quebec, and hopefully we're also going to start to see our East Coast, the Maritimes, come on board. We're also seeing a nice split between CNG and LNG. You have to remember that up until 4 years ago, there was no use of LNG in Canada as a vehicle fuel. So also really exciting to see the interest in LNG and all the research that fleets are now doing to understand whether LNG could be a good fit for them depending on what they're doing. This adoption has been in both public and private sector fleets, so pretty balanced across the board and a really great foundation moving forward here. The other aspect of the investments and the changes we're seeing in the market is we're seeing the early investment in infrastructure to support trucking corridors. Now, clearly in the U.S. market, with over 100 stations and with clean energy playing a very major role in this space to build out that network of stations, the America's Natural Gas Highway, that's also a great model that we're looking to emulate in Canada, although here the focus is mostly on the eastern corridor, Windsor to Quebec City, and you see now 4 stations there. That's a start. More will be coming. And now moving on to western Canada, Vancouver to Edmonton, and potentially on to Fort McMurray. There are 5 stations at this point in time, combination between permanent and mobile. Again, none of this infrastructure existed 2.5 years ago, so very exciting times. We're just at the beginning, and this is all private money going in to get this going in the market in Canada. Okay, so with that, that's just a little snapshot on what's actually going on in the market here. For the presentation, I'm going to take you through why are we seeing this interest in Canada. You know, Canada was an early adopter in this area going back to the 80s and 90s. Why is it coming back? Then I'll get into what are the engines and the vehicles that are available if you want to go in this direction, and then dive deeper on the 3 segments where we're seeing most of the activity, transit, refuse, and the highway tractor segment. We'll look at some broad adoption indicators there and also get into 3 specific fleet profiles and some of the numbers to look at the business case for those opportunities. And then finally, I'm just going to wrap up to talk about what are some of the other elements that we're doing to really improve the system so that when fleets want to switch to natural gas, everything is ready for them to go. Once they've verified that business case, everything else is in place to help them. So now getting into it, you've already seen this, so I'm just going to go on. I should mention that, yeah, it is, I work for the National Trade Association here in Canada. Okay, so let's go right to the heart of the matter here. Why has natural gas come back? Well, I think everybody probably knows this. The fundamental reason is supply. In North America, we do now have more than 100 years of supply. And demand for natural gas is the other important part of the equation. Demand in traditional markets is pretty steady, maybe a little bit of growth. The only high growth area for natural gas use in Canada is oil sands. And Canada is exporting less and less natural gas to the U.S. because the U.S. also has a tremendous natural gas resource base. So this is a real challenge. And where is the resource going to go? There are three options here: power generation in Canada, export to Asia, and then transportation. So that's an important driver, and important to understand too when we look at government interest and the increasing interest in that regard. So the resource part is critical. Another critical part, though, is the affordability of natural gas. It's important to understand how to do the basic math. So a barrel of oil has just under 6 million BTU of natural gas, 5.8 as you see in the slide here, and a barrel of oil today sells for about $93. The equivalent amount of energy when it's natural gas sells for only $23, okay? So that's on a commodity-to-commodity basis. But as you can appreciate, that's a very moderate price point for natural gas. And because, to go back to that previous slide, because of the resource base we're looking at, most analysts are projecting moderate pricing for natural gas looking ahead. So this is quite an exciting opportunity in North America. The other interest for policymakers is around the GHG, or carbon emissions reductions. This slide just shows for a highway tractor, you know, what if you go to the single wide tires, you improve the aerodynamics, the drivers get trained to operate those vehicles more effectively. How do all these options compare to alternate fuels? You see here B5, 5% biodiesel, that's the purple bar. And then you see compressed and liquefied natural gas. Well, big potential when you start to fold natural gas into the mix. And of course now Canada is harmonized with the U.S. on vehicle regulations, and we now have vehicle regulations for light and heavy that are greenhouse gas based. So as we see those regulations start to filter more and more into what vehicles the manufacturers are producing, that this potentially could be another important support to make more natural gas vehicles available in the North American market. Finally, on renewed interest is absolutely the improvement in technology. The nice thing about having a past, having some history, is that we've had time to come up the curve. We've had more than 30 years. The current engine technology for the medium and heavy truck and bus, this is 4th generation technology. So there's been significant improvement on fuel consumption, on power, on torque, as well as on related systems like integrated fuel systems that go onto the vehicle. And in addition, on refueling stations, tremendous improvement in the technologies here. So that's the other nice thing now about all that history. We're now really reaping the dividends in the market, and that's great news for fleets in terms of effectiveness of these technologies and the affordability of the technologies. Okay, I'm now going to transition into what's available and just very quickly highlight this. I think as there's been a number of changes in the engine space, so I did want to just go through this slide. You see the two engines in the upper left. These are the current available engines from Cummins Westport. So the dedicated natural gas operate on CNG or LNG, the 9-liter ISLG on the left, and then the 12-liter ISX-12G. You see the horsepower range, so that takes us up to 400 horsepower, and at present that is what is available for the factory-built vehicles. Now the good news is we do have a new product coming to the market from Volvo, and my understanding is they're going to start to take orders later this year, and that will get us above the 400 horsepower up to, I guess it's about 450, I think is what Volvo is saying here. That's really helpful. And the other thing coming is the smaller natural gas engine. Not till 2015 from Cummins Westport, but the 6.7 will be coming as well. So as with anything, it takes time to start to fill in these gaps and have a whole portfolio available. But absolutely, those investments are being made, and that's, again, great news for fleets because it will open up more options. On the vehicle availability side, this slide just details what are the highway tractors that you can buy today. And essentially, you know, manufacturers make their vehicles to sell them into the North American market. So if a vehicle is on here, it can be purchased in Canada or the U.S. There's a lot of different options on fuel systems, on their total capacity, where they're located. But I just wanted to at least start with the snapshot of what can you actually buy. And as mentioned, the engines operate on either CNG or LNG. I should mention, if you go to CumminsWestport.com, find a truck or bus builder, you can also see which engine is available in which vehicle. Okay, so obviously if you're looking for the 12-liter engine, the higher horsepower product. The other important thing I want to highlight here, just because it is noted on this slide, this goes back to the engine technology. The other advantage natural gas now has is that unlike the diesel engine technology, there is no need for a particulate filter and there is no need for an SCR system. So you're now looking at technology that is fully compliant with the EPA emission standards, but it is simpler technology and less expensive to maintain. So that is a big deal too, and something to keep in mind as you're comparing the technologies to diesel. Now moving on to the refuse trucks and transit buses, this table is from the gowithnaturalgas.ca website. Just tells you what is currently available. Obviously, the point being across all these vehicles that all the major manufacturers are now offering natural gas factory built, and that's great news. And as they continue to gradually expand what they're bringing to the market with the natural gas product. Okay, switching now, I'm going to just transition now to, okay, let's go deeper on the individual segments. So looking at transit, there have been a number of announcements in Canada on transit over the last, I would say actually about 6 months, 6 to 9 months. Nanaimo was the first, so that was a BC Transit, moving forward with a new CNG transit bus project there and a new station. Kamloops then followed from BC Transit as well. Hamilton Street Railway, I'm going to go deeper on their situation with 18 buses and a new station. And then a big announcement just a month ago that Calgary Transit had secured some federal funding to build a new gas-safe facility. Calgary has been studying natural gas for several years, but finally determined that because all their facilities were really at capacity, when they were going to make this change, they really needed to do it in parallel with a new facility. So now they've got the green light on that, and this will be a purpose-built facility capable of holding up to 400 CNG transit buses. So that's very big news, and to be fair, the Canadian transit industry really did a lot of the tough work on the first generation engine technology. So it's great now to see that the transits are seeing the numbers and finding that business case to move forward and come back now that the technology has improved. We also, of course, in Canada do have our 2 transit bus manufacturers who also offer the factory-built New Flyer and Nova. So now let's go a little bit deeper on Hamilton Street Railway. As many of you may have seen, back in the spring, you know, Hamilton, they've got about 220 buses now. They, at one point in time, had more than 100 of those were natural gas, but that number gradually went down over the years as they retired older generation natural gas buses. So they kind of had reached 35 buses, and then really now starting to take a look at natural gas and their operating history with that, because 10 years ago they had decided, no, we're going to get out of natural gas, we're finding it too expensive, and go back to diesel. But
Alicia, could I just interrupt? Could you
Sure.
clarify for the audience where Hamilton is and maybe just
Sure.
give a sense of the community and size?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so Hamilton is not too far from Toronto. It's a community of, I would say, at least 500,000 people, so a fairly big urban center. And actually, originally, the natural gas transit bus was developed there because Hamilton is famous for its steel mills. But with steel come air quality challenges. So that was the original genesis going back 30 years to develop a natural gas transit bus and to do it in Hamilton, Ontario. So yeah, so they've got a long history with this. They're certainly very knowledgeable, but one of the trends they track, of course, fuel pricing as well as maintenance costs. And you see in the third bullet here, this is a quote from Hamilton. You know, starting since 2009, what they've seen on diesel is they're now paying more than $1 a liter. And if you multiply that by 3.7, 3.8, you'll get up to your dollars per gallon. So big jump in diesel pricing. The other thing Hamilton started to notice is that the maintenance costs for their natural gas buses were actually starting to trend lower than for their 2010 diesel buses because of the cost of maintaining the exhaust aftertreatment technology. So these were two very important, you know, things for Hamilton to go deeper on. The result was staff had spent a tremendous amount of time to do the analysis and basically come back to City Council recommending a full return to natural gas use and starting to do it basically so on their annual bus purchases, which are about 17 to 18 buses a year, starting to buy those all as natural gas and essentially fully transform the fleet over about the next 7 years to a natural gas only fleet. Okay, so moving on, this next slide really now goes more into the business case for Hamilton. And many of you may have seen in the report to Council, they showed some natural gas pricing compared to diesel. Some of that pricing you see on the very first line is the delivered cost of natural gas as a commodity. Now, commodity is part of the cost, but of course it's got to be compressed. And typically, if you look at CNG pricing, the commodity itself is typically about 30 to 35%, maybe 40% of the dispense cost, okay? And obviously with compression, there's the cost of equipment, there's the cost of power, etc. The other thing you have to consider is while there have been tremendous improvement in the engine performance, there still is a difference on fuel consumption with the natural gas engines. So you see here about 12% added based on Cummins Westport's figures for that, and then converted to diesel, all in to say basically that they can improve their fuel pricing and save about 28 cents a diesel liter equivalent, or that would be roughly $1.20 per gallon by going back to CNG. Now down below you get a little more detail here on their annual mileage, about 70,000 kilometers a year. And then, so looking at fuel costs that are, you know, more than $10,000 a year and a payback of just over 3 years per bus. As I had mentioned, given that they're acquiring buses at the rate of about 18 a year, that starts to aggregate into a very major fuel savings, so $4.6 million over the 12-year life of the bus, assuming they hold those buses for 12 years. Those numbers were very compelling, and that's the reason that this Hamilton is now moving forward with the natural gas initiative. So that's the transit case study. Now let's move on to refuse. Again, some of the specifics of what is going on in the market. There have been a lot of recent announcements, but just to give you sort of who's operating, well, we've got EBI operating in Montreal with about 50 CNG refuse trucks and continuing to grow that fleet. Amterra operating on the west coast in Surrey, British Columbia, as well as in Winnipeg, so in a very cold weather environment. Green for Life operating in both Hamilton and Orangeville. Both of those are in the Toronto area. Waste Management up to about 50 trucks in Canada, but with other projects under review, and that's in Ottawa and the West Coast, and then Progressive Waste, both on the West Coast and in Barrie, and Barrie is near Toronto. So Canada essentially is starting to catch up. You know, certainly in the U.S. for at least the last few years, we've seen natural gas go in at a rate of more than half of the new trucks going into the on the road are natural gas powered trucks. So great to see this movement in Canada and starting to track more toward the level of activity in the U.S. Now looking at a profile, this is some information pulled together based on publicly available information related to Waste Management and their fleet in Ottawa. That fleet involves 25 MAC collection trucks. It's a time fill, fast fill setup at that station. And you see here the amount of fuel, about 75 to 100 diesel gallon equivalent, or 280 to 370 diesel liter equivalent. I'm sure, as most people on this call know, Waste Management has a very significant commitment to natural gas use in North America and intend to replace 80% of the trucks they retire with natural gas, driven both by the business case, the economic benefits, as well as the emissions benefits and their ability to provide their customers with a greener service. In that regard, too, Waste Management has a strategic partnership with IMW on the equipment side. So the next slide here, again, these are estimated costs. Obviously, these kind of figures are not, with Hamilton, those were figures that had been taken forward to City Council in the public domain. But with a commercial fleet, of course, this has been cobbled together from public sources. So it is an estimate, just to make you aware of that. So again, here you see their fuel savings. In this case of about 30%, so 32 cents a diesel liter equivalent, or more than $1.20 a gallon. They drive the trucks about 250 kilometers a day, and based on their annual fuel consumption, they're looking at savings of more than $14,000 a year and a payback of around 3 years. Again, aggregating that fleet-wide for these trucks just on the Hamilton site, or sorry, on the Ottawa site, more than $2.5 million in fuel cost savings over the life of those trucks. So again, a very significant economic gain for the fleet operating natural gas.
Alicia, it's Dave. There's
yes.
kind of a very relevant question coming in here.
Okay.
Actually, there's two related ones. One from Mitch, who's saying, did Hamilton have any incentive programs to pay for capital, the conversions?
For the vehicles themselves, I presume, right?
Yes.
No, no, they didn't. Originally when Hamilton got into natural gas, at that point in time, there was a lot of incentive funding from the province of Ontario. And Ontario itself used to have Daimler making natural gas transit buses in the province. So the province really wanted to encourage the purchase of those vehicles. That's not the case this time. There is no incentive funding at all for the new transit buses that Hamilton will buy, except for the normal funding that they would get on any bus purchase. It's comparable to that.
And do you see that, is that across the board? There's another question just related, talking about whether or not incentives are a big factor in natural gas vehicle adoption. Normally these programs I've seen in other conservation programs across Canada have fairly significant federal funding and incentives. Are you seeing that now?
What we're seeing in that regard, certainly in the past, before you had the real change in the natural gas supply picture, if you were looking at a much narrower savings margin, then it appeared that you really needed incentives to make this work. That's just not the case anymore with the supply picture and with the very moderate natural gas pricing that we're seeing and that we expect to see going out in the future. Now, that said, there are jurisdictions in Canada, like British Columbia, that do have an incentive program, and we're certainly very supportive of that because we recognize that for fleets to move in this direction, there are a number of costs, and if some of those costs can be reduced or taken off the table, all the better, and that will certainly accelerate adoption. But in terms of the strict business case, do you have to have incentive to make the business case work? No, absolutely not. And the next, the highway tractor example that I'll walk you through here, what you'll see is that the incentive really sweetened the business case considerably. There was still a good business case without it, but you'll see how that filtered through and allowed the fleet to spend in other areas.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. All right, so with that, let's move on then to highway tractors and what's been going on in that segment. Many of you, of course, will know about the Vetter Transport project with the 50 LNG tractors operating in Abbotsford, British Columbia, one of the first in Canada, and a big breakout project a few years ago. Similarly, with Robert Transport operating in eastern Canada, 120 LNG tractors, Peterbilt operating between Montreal and Mississauga. Bison Transport also now has the 15 LNG tractors in Calgary with refueling from Shell at 2 of Shell stations in Alberta. Loblaw is another one that has now brought some of the tractors into their fleet, and there's some other projects going on as well that are more at the smaller scale where fleets are trying to get their hands on the vehicles, understand them, and figure out how best to integrate them, just as we've seen in the U.S. with early activity in the highway trucking area. Now, I wanted to point out, too, that of all the activity in highway in Canada, up until this year, it was all LNG tractors. Now we have the first fleet in Canada that's using CNG for their tractor fleet, and these are Mack tandem axle tractors in the Cold Star Solutions fleet. They operate on Vancouver Island, and I'm going to take you through more of the details of their adoption and why they moved in this direction. So looking at Cold Star, they're a medium-sized fleet. They've got about 45 trucks and a regional operator operating on Vancouver Island. They deliver food that is refrigerated. So they haul up to 80,000 pounds using these tandem axle tractors. And you see their fuel storage here, and their daily mileage about 210 kilometers, so no problem in terms of having enough fuel on board to meet their daily requirements. When they looked for fuel supply, they ended up working with Fortis BC, and Fortis built a station to supply this fleet. And of course, so then there's a fuel purchase contract there. But that station, which is in Langford near Victoria, on the island, also there's potential for other fleets to access that station. And we do expect that as more of these stations go in, there will be more ability to access third-party infrastructure through a fuel card or a card lock type of setup. So let's looking at the Cold Star numbers. Again here, this is kind of backed out the other way. The fleet has said publicly they're already saving 30% on their fuel. They think when they get to a steady state of operations, they're going to get that down to, well, up to 40%. So these numbers have sort of been backed out from the 30%. You see their daily driving there and their annual fuel savings approaching $12,000 per truck per year. Now here's where you really see the role of incentive. The Fortis BC incentive covered 75% of the incremental cost for natural gas, so about $48,000. And that really brought that payback down to a very low level of in and around a year, basically. Cold Star has certainly gone on record to say, we're a small operator. We couldn't have done this without incentive. And I think we're going to start to see more and more of that while we can have the very large corporate early adopters, it's also, we're starting to move into that phase of the market where we want to try to get also smaller and medium-sized operators have the ability to access natural gas and to get the same level of benefits from it. So this is a really interesting one to watch, and I think we're going to see more CNG adoption now as the awareness grows around this being, again, it's got to fit with the business operation. Definitely not a one-size-fits-all here, but for this particular fleet, they're reaping very significant benefits and also, again, can market that green service for their customer.
Alicia, this has sparked a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Are these trucks running on 100% CNG LNG, or do they run in bi-fuel mode, which combines diesel and CNG at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I probably skipped over that a bit. Going back just mentally to the engine slide, both of those Cummins Westport engines are dedicated natural gas engines. There is no diesel pilot and there is no bi-fuel. So they are 100% on CNG. So I guess to go back to the Cold Star adoption, clearly too, they have to have their whole fuel supply and their routing all sorted out to make sure that they can get their daily business done. There is no backup to operate on another fuel, and there is no limp home capacity, and nor should there need to be, provided they've got enough fuel on board to meet their daily driving requirements, then they're good to go.
And one question here, what are the CNG fueling pressures allowed in Canada?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and actually I've got that on a later slide here, but Canada historically limited public stations to 3,000 psi and private stations to 3,600 psi, which is the standard in the U.S. We just had the code updated in Canada, so as of spring of this year, it's now 3,600 at public and private, and we're fully harmonized with the U.S. So that's great, and while most of the projects I talked about, the new refuse, transit, etc., most of these private station projects are going in at 3,600, we will now start to see the opportunity to also filter that through to the public station system, especially as we start to see public stations built for heavy trucks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So that wraps up sort of the business case, looking across these different applications. I'm now going to just spend about 5 minutes here and just talk to you about, we recognize this isn't, you've got to make sure you can get the available power and type of vehicle that you need for your operation, and there has to be a good business case and other benefits related to environment, etc. But we recognize, too, that fleets don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in a system, and the more things we can do to strengthen that system, the easier it will be to implement these projects. So just as mentioned, the very first point here, we've been doing a lot of work on bringing the codes and standards up to where they need to be in Canada, and with reference to where the American codes and standards are, so that we have a more harmonized approach which will help everyone in the system. So we have updated the public pressure. The other thing we've been able to do is update our CNG vehicle code, which is CSA B109, so we now have what's called a harmonized vehicle impact loading requirement. That's great news because it means when a manufacturer like Freightliner builds a truck for Canada, they don't have to do anything different. They can engineer that truck the same way they would for the U.S. market. So that's excellent news. On the LNG side, I mentioned that LNG hadn't been used in the past as a vehicle fuel in Canada. So we didn't have a code. That work has now been done, and the LNG refueling code content is in Annex D to our CSA Z276 code. There's also work now started through CSA Group to develop harmonized North American standards. This is for things like the nozzle and the receptacle on refueling, the LNG tank, and there's a list of others. And all the stakeholders agree, if these component standards are being developed, let's develop them on a harmonized North American basis. So I think that's great, and it's going to support future adoption. Now, on gas-safe facilities, here's an area where Canada is behind the U.S. The U.S. does have a code in this area, but Canada does not. So 2 years ago in Canada, we developed a technical guideline. It's essentially a 65-page engineering-type document that identifies what are all the various considerations you need to think about in terms of air exchanges, methane detection, venting, etc. And then what are all the codes and standards that apply to this area. So now that that guideline is available from the CNGVA at no cost in English and French, now that we've got the guideline, though, the next step is to move it to code. So CSA will be developing and will be creating a new committee to develop this code. They will start with the existing technical guideline, and in Canada we have different electrical code requirements and some different building code requirements. So they'll basically start with all of these as inputs and develop this new code, which ultimately then can be referenced in regulation. So we expect the code work to start late this year, early next year, on about an 18-month timeline. So I think that's very good news too. And again, the guideline, a lot of that content will migrate over to the code. So it'll give a good starting point for that and more certainty.
If I could jump in and give a little push for our brothers across the line, there was a webinar that is available on the website on facility improvements for fleets converting to CNG LNG. And Clean Energy has a dedicated division to facility improvements. So if anybody has any specific questions on that, please feel free to reference that previous webinar or contact us for information.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. And I think the other thing to point out too is that, you know, if you're at that stage, you're just getting started and you're going to talk to your local dealer and you're trying to figure out how we're going to get a facility where we can maintain the vehicles, what we've seen in a lot of the early projects is often it's the local dealer. So for Cold Star, for instance, the local Mac dealer modified their shop so that they can service these vehicles for the fleet customer. In some cases, it's the engine distributor modifying their facility or the fleet themselves. But there are different paths forward to get those needs addressed. Now, the final system improvement I want to point to here is the availability of training. Competency-based technical training. Right now in Canada, there's some sort of old remnants of past training for aftermarket conversions, but there's not much more. So training courses have been developed. We're just in the process of mapping out how to bring those to the market. They will be technical in nature, including courses for mechanics who perform routine service on CNG and LNG vehicles, as well as interactive videos for operators and drivers who refuel CNG and LNG vehicles. So stay tuned on those, and I think that also will be good news and one more support to get going on deployment. So finally then, I just want to wrap up by mentioning the other system support that we've been very involved with, and that is the gowithnaturalgas.ca website. In addition to the website, if you haven't already been there, it's a great starting point as far as understanding all the basics of what you need to think about to move forward. But I should mention, too, we now do have through industry and government funding, 3 outreach hubs operating across Canada. They can be reached through the website or on their toll-free number, and they are a source for any question, any type of information you have. They also are holding workshops over the fall and spring, and they're just developing their fall schedule right now, so that should be up on this website shortly. And with that, just the final, start your research now. We know it's a long timeline. If you're well into your research, that's fantastic, and if we can help facilitate going deeper, please let us know. And then, of course, there's the website and the outreach hubs. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
Absolutely, and I'd just like to say that Alicia and the Canadian Natural Gas Vehicle Alliance has just been a tremendous resource. The NGV associations, some of you have heard Steve Ubora, Alicia's counterpart across the line, and also her counterparts around the world have been an extraordinary resource for us at IMW in our global reach. So I'd encourage everybody to take full advantage of the resources they have. I mean, we've certainly seen the research available here just in this presentation, as you've seen in Steve Ubora, so some great content there. Now, there is an additional question here, and it relates back to, I guess, government support, Alicia. Is the government supportive of greater use of natural gas vehicles? And if so, what are they doing to help fleets?
Yeah, another interesting question and an important part of the system. The great news here is that, yes, we're seeing increasing government engagement at the federal level to encourage greater use of natural gas in the transportation sector. And we're seeing that not just in Canada, but in the U.S. as well. Many of you may have seen there was just an agreement signed yesterday between Canada and the U.S., between the Energy Secretary and our Minister of Natural Resources, to identify priority areas to work on, and one of them is encouraging the use of natural gas in transportation. That's very helpful. That hopefully is going to filter into more support for end users and more support to ensure that the codes and standards and regulations are up to date and harmonized and clear so that people can implement their projects and they know what they need to do to comply and move forward. So, you know, there are other areas, of course, like, you know, fuel tax treatment, incentive on vehicle. These are all discussions that we certainly are having in Canada, and I understand they're also underway in the U.S. But I would say directionally, yeah, we continue to see more and more engagement from both federal governments, and that's very encouraging. And there I would go back to that resource slide that I showed you. Both countries have a tremendous natural gas resource, and while some of it may be exported offshore, there's a need for new markets for the resource, and I think policymakers recognize that, and they also recognize the lower emissions profile, and there's some benefits that both countries can derive there. So that's great news, I think, for all of us.
Great, and I'll just give a bit of a heads up. For the first time, we've got hands raised for verbal questions here. We see you folks, Cynthia and Ricardo and John and Ever. I will be getting to you momentarily, so if you want to stand by, and we don't want to catch you off guard when we take your mute off there. We've actually never done that before, but we'll give it a go. So while you're preparing, here's another question coming in. When will we see more vehicle models available in the market, including light-duty vehicle models?
So, Dave, I guess you've taken me back off mute then, or not?
Yeah, you're.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
You're off mute. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you know, as I showed, there's certainly a very solid foundation of medium and heavy vehicles. There's also a good foundation of factory-built light-duty vehicles and aftermarket conversion, certified aftermarket conversions already. Yeah, it is a trickle, but a trickle that's going in the right direction to again increase the number of models and the various types of applications. And I can say on the light-duty side of the spectrum, you know, Chrysler, of course, already has their Dodge Ram in the market. GM has both pickup truck, cargo van, and now they're bringing the Impala to the market. And Ford also has natural gas prepped vehicles that are going into primarily commercial or public sector fleet operations, pickup trucks primarily. But yeah, there's definitely a good base there of available vehicles. And as we see the infrastructure grow, and even just looking at the Canadian example, more than 20 stations in 2 years, that's absolutely going in the right direction. And as the infrastructure grows, we will see more models brought to the market.
Great. We've got another couple of questions that have just come in before I go to the phone. Are you able to get carbon credits as an incentive to switch to natural gas in Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is an area. I know Shell was working on the potential for a system to be recognized in the Alberta carbon market. I'm not sure of the status if that's fully complete. Westport at a point in time also had a system for carbon credits. I guess the simple answer to that is there's a lot of interest in that, but there's not one national system. But that said, if you get to an aggregate, a large enough level of credits, that's when I think it's a question of how to fit that into the system and how to monetize that. And we also, of course, now in both British Columbia and Quebec do have carbon-based regimes in place. So I would say that's an area that probably requires further digging. We're certainly happy to help with that digging if there's a certain jurisdiction. But yeah, it's not a simple one answer there, but directionally we see that coming.
Great. There was a question here which is burning on everybody's mind. Where was that one here? Do you agree that LNG is a better choice for highway tractor due to higher BTU volume, and CNG is a better choice, less expensive for transit and refuse? This is the question of all questions. I'll lead you to that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, certainly I would say the common wisdom is that CNG is simpler and easier to use for the return to base applications that don't have the high daily driving requirements and whose range needs can be met with CNG. Now, on the highway tractor side, again, it will depend on the application, and it's interesting to see in the U.S. where you've got major players going forward building LNG refueling infrastructure, but also high-capacity CNG refueling infrastructure for heavy trucks. And that's even filtering now into the codes and standards area where, you know, a lot of the dispensers, for instance, are built more for light-duty vehicles, and there's work being done to be able to fill a Class 8 truck. So I think the jury's still out when it comes to the highway tractor side of things. Will really depend on how the vehicle is used, can the range needs be met, and also can the fuel consumption, how high is that fuel consumption? Because of course we know CNG, once it's in the tank, it's in the tank. LNG though, as it does warm up, it has a hold time and certainly is fine for 5 days or so, depending on the standard the tank has been built to. But LNG is more suitable for vehicles that are in constant use. That way there's no issues with boil off. That's fully managed just through the inherent use of the vehicle. So it's going to be interesting as we see more and more of the infrastructure build out in Canada, U.S., and connecting both countries. But it is a bit hard to call right now on the highway tractor side and how much of that may actually go to regional CNG for Class 8.
Great, thank you. We're going to throw Dave Van Laar on the spot here, I think. Alicia, maybe you might be able to jump in as well. This is a good one. Is there anything we've learned with regards to cold weather operations in Canada? Are there any particular issues with the CNG at cold ambient temperatures? Dave, I mean, we certainly have our experiences with that, I think.
Sure, yeah, Canada, that's one of our challenges. I think, Alicia, you can answer a lot better on the vehicle side. I can mention the station and the equipment, where definitely we do put in cold weather packages for the equipment, and make sure that all the design piping and that is designed for the cold weather. But generally speaking, the equipment operates very well in Winnipeg and other places where it is very cold.
Sorry, Dave, I think you were just a little far away from the mic. Could you just repeat? Sorry about that.
I was just going to mention, I'm sorry about that. Alicia, you can mention a bit more on the vehicle side because there's been some studies I know on that. On the equipment side, on the compression side and the filling side, definitely IMW has a lot of experience in cold weather climates. And we do have special kits that we put onto the compression units to have them work effectively in those cold climates. But we have very good stations working in Winnipeg and other cold climates for sure.
Dave, just on that, I know that our recent experience in Russia, we're working with Russian machines over there and putting our first stations in Nizhny Novgorod, and there they have Arctic-style cold in the winter, and the concerns on they have very wet gas and the dryers. In North America, I haven't seen us really putting those dryers in enclosures, and certainly on the waste management sites that Alicia was referring to, the dryers are external and don't seem to be covered. Do we do a lot with warming the dryers, or are those aspects that we haven't experienced yet over in North America?
In cold climates where you're going to see below minus, say, 20 Celsius regularly, we do recommend putting the dryers in enclosures, and we have a fair amount of these sites where we do that. We put them inside enclosures, heated enclosures.
Okay, great.
And it's mainly for serviceability purposes, not operating, but yeah.
And then on the vehicle side, Alicia, what have you heard or seen from our experiences here with cold weather and CNG?
Yeah, on the vehicle side, we did do a study about a year and a half ago with Transport Canada's support, and we looked at the EBI fleet operating in the Montreal area as well as some perspective on the Emterra fleet operating in Winnipeg. And the key findings there were just as you would winterize a diesel vehicle, so the same types of aids you might use for diesel, you should be using for natural gas if you are in a cold climate condition. So it could be oil pan heaters, for instance, winter fronts, that sort of thing. As part of that work, though, too, certainly with Emterra, they were really the first large-scale cold weather, for the 58 trucks operating in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg can be very extreme in its temperatures. Now, in Emterra's case, they have had challenges because the design of the vehicle was a little more challenging in terms of keeping the air intake temperature where it needed to be for the engine. So that actually had to do more with vehicle design and suitability of, that particular model was probably one that was better to be used in the south or in warm temperature. But generally, the same things you would consider for a diesel vehicle, you should think about for a natural gas vehicle operating in cold weather.
Okay.
And there is a report with more detail if anyone would like to contact me for that report.
Oh, terrific. Now, I'm not sure if you've covered this already, but we've spoken a lot of what I would classify as heavy-duty vehicles. And Mitch was just asking, has there been any movement or growth in light-duty fleets, such as pickup trucks and vans? One example I'm thinking of is for utility fleets.
Yeah, I'd say there's been more activity south of the border than there has been in Canada. We are starting to see, especially in Western Canada, a number of the natural gas producers get more serious about using natural gas in their fleets. And of course, the utilities in Canada have had a long-term commitment to natural gas use, and Enbridge, operating in Ontario, they have the largest natural gas fleet in the country because of that commitment. But I think some of the major successes we've seen in the U.S., such as the AT&T fleet, that still needs to trickle further into Canada so that fleets recognize. And I think, to be fair, as we see more infrastructure, that will also help with that light-duty fleet adoption.
Now, I'm putting you on a bit of a spot here, but taking another tack, we've spoken about NGVs. Have you seen anything, you mentioned briefly in one of your slides about industry use of natural gas, and at IMW we encountered this with the McCain plant and PEI shifting to natural gas using a virtual pipeline across the Confederation Bridge from a mother station source in Quebec City, or in Quebec, the province of Quebec. Is there anything you'd like to comment on that trend, or what are you seeing there?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, Dave, and that's something that the economics, I know you mentioned we've got other global audience members here. That whole idea of trucking bulk CNG to a particular site, whether then it's used for transportation or an industrial customer, that's something that's been done in a lot of other countries around the world, but not typically in North America, mostly because here we do have a very extensive underground pipeline network in both countries. But that's really changing now, and the project you mentioned with McCain Foods, there's also a project with Greenfield Ethanol in Ontario where they are trucking bulk CNG and also using it in their industrial facility. And there's also a fascinating project in Saskatchewan where they are taking stranded gas from gas production sites, compressing it and putting it into a processing system. So basically monetizing gas that would otherwise be wasted. I think these opportunities, we're seeing more and more interest in them, and definitely we're seeing more government interest in understanding, can natural gas also help in some of our remote and northern communities and in mining sites that right now that is all diesel that at least in the far north is very heavily subsidized and very expensive fuel. So that's a really interesting opportunity, and I think there's going to be more growth in the area.
Fantastic. Well, I think most of our questions are answered. Thank you very much for that lively interaction. And Alicia, thank you so much for your contribution today. Would just like to remind everybody, if you go to our website, imw.ca/CNG webinars, you'll be able to sign up for the next ones upcoming. We've got Biogas Part 2, Technology and Components, Considerations for Solid Waste and Digester Projects. Then we have CNG for heavy-duty trucking, full system review and case studies, and industrial gas, virtual pipeline case studies, food processing plant. How timely is that? Please remember to send in, if you're at a boardroom table with several engineers, the information that was mentioned before, and we'll ensure that you get your proof of attendance. If you have any other questions, you can send them to sales@imw.ce, webinars@imw.ca, and of course visit our website as well as Alicia's contact information. Happy to send that to you. We take these webinars, they're recorded, edited, and then posted on our website for your use in any way you see fit. So please feel free to take advantage of that resource. And again, our sincere thanks to Alicia and Dave Van Laar for supporting us here, and we look forward to seeing everybody next month. Thank you.